on November 19th, 1988, in a friend's villa outside Buenos Aires. One of the richest women on earth was found dead in a bathtub. She was 37 years old. The cause was heart failure, but the people who knew her said the real cause had no medical name. She had inherited a shipping empire worth more than 500 million. She owned a private island, the most famous yacht in the world, jets, palaces, jewels, and by the end, she was reportedly paying people, by the month, simply to be her friends. How does a woman who can buy almost anything end up unable to buy the one thing every human being needs? And how does a fortune large enough to last lifetimes leave its heiress, the loneliest person in the world? This is the story of the Onassis dynasty. Her father rose from the ashes of a burning city to become one of the richest men alive. And he raised his daughter, Christina, on a single unspoken law. That money is the only thing no one can ever take from you. She would spend her whole life testing that law against the human heart. A father who lost everything at 16 and decided love was a weakness. A brother, the chosen heir, dead in the sky at 24. And 4 marriages, each one shadowed by the same unanswerable question. Do you want me? Or do you want the money? Watch this not as the story of a spoiled heiress. Watch it as the question every fortune eventually forces. If you can buy anything, how will you ever know what's real? And remember one small thing, a glass of Diet Coke, flown across continents by private jet. We will come back to what it really was. Begin with a 16-year-old boy watching his entire world burn. In September 1922, the city of Smyrna, then one of the great cosmopolitan ports of the Mediterranean, home to a large and prosperous Greek population, was consumed by fire as the Greco-Turkish War reached its catastrophic end. From the deck of a ship, a teenager watched the skyline of his birthplace dissolve into smoke. His family had been wealthy tobacco merchants. In a matter of days, the fortune was gone, the city was gone, the world he had been born into simply ceased to exist. His name was Aristotle Socrates Onassis, and the lesson of that burning city would govern every day of the rest of his life. Picture what he carried out. A refugee, traveling on a Nansen passport, the document issued to the stateless. Arriving in Argentina in 1923 with almost nothing in his pockets. A boy who had been rich, then refugee, then immigrant, inside a single year. He took night work, learned to survive, watched every coin. And somewhere in that descent, Aristotle Onassis drew a conclusion that would become the secret engine of the entire dynasty. He had learned, at 16, that everything could be taken from you in a single night. Your home, your country, your family's money, your safety. Everything except one thing. A fortune large enough, controlled tightly enough, spread across enough of the world, could never be taken again. Money, to Aristotle Onassis, was not luxury. It was the only security that existed. It was the only thing that was real. It is a logical conclusion for a refugee to reach. It is also a quiet poison, because a man who believes that money is the only real thing will, in the end, measure people by it too, including the ones he loves, including his own children. The world would come to know Aristotle Onassis as a charmer, a seducer, a man of immense warmth and appetite. But underneath the charm ran the cold arithmetic of the boy on the ship. Love could burn, countries could burn, money, properly built, could not. He set out to build a fortune that could survive the end of the world. And he very nearly did. The rise was one of the most spectacular in the history of money. In Argentina, Onassis built a tobacco importing business and made his first fortune by his mid-20s. But tobacco was not his destiny. He looked at the world and saw that everything, oil, grain, goods, the lifeblood of the modern economy, had to move across water. And the man who owned the ships owned the choke point. So, in the depths of the Great Depression, when the world's shipping fleets sat idle and freighters could be bought for pennies on the dollar, Onassis did the opposite of everyone else. He bought. He purchased surplus cargo ships at rock-bottom prices, betting that trade would return. It did, and when it did, he owned the boats. From there, he built relentlessly. He moved into oil tankers, and then into supertankers, pioneering the giant vessels that would carry the world's petroleum, the perfect instrument for a man who wanted to own the flow of the modern economy. He built a whaling fleet, an airline, Olympic Airways, Greece's national carrier, and a controlling interest in Monte Carlo itself, through the company that ran the famous casino and much of Monaco. He registered ships under flags of convenience, minimized every tax, and answered to no single nation, a stateless refugee who had made statelessness into a business strategy. By the post-war decades, Aristotle Onassis was one of the richest men on the planet, master of one of the largest privately controlled shipping fleets in the world. The penniless refugee on the Nansen passport now owned a fleet that moved a meaningful slice of global trade across the oceans. And in 1946, he did what men of his world did. He married strategically. His bride was Athena Tina Livanos, the teenage daughter of Stavros Livanos, one of the greatest Greek shipowners of all. It was a love match and a dynastic merger at once. Two shipping fortunes joined. The marriage produced two children, a son, Alexander, in 1948, and a daughter, Christina, in 1950. The dynasty had its heirs. The fortune had its future. And Aristotle Onassis, the boy who watched everything burn, had finally built the thing that could not be taken from him. Or so he believed. Stand on the deck of the yacht Christina O, at the height of the Onassis world. And the glamour is almost blinding. He had named the greatest yacht of the age after his daughter, a converted warship transformed into a 325-foot floating palace, with a swimming pool that converted to a dance floor, priceless art, bar stools upholstered in whale leather, and a guest list that read like the 20th century itself. Winston Churchill, Greta Garbo, Maria Callas. Kings and presidents. Picture his private kingdom, the island of Scorpios in the Ionian Sea, bought and landscaped into a personal paradise. The opera diva Maria Callas on his arm, the most famous love affair in Europe, and his name spoken, everywhere, as a synonym for wealth without limit. The refugee who now dined with the rulers of the earth. He had built it exactly as he'd planned on that burning ship, a fortune so vast, so mobile, so untouchable that no fire, no war, no government could ever take it from him. And here is the cruelty hidden inside the triumph. Aristotle Onassis had successfully made himself invulnerable to everything he feared as a boy. He had armored himself completely against loss. But he had built that armor by believing money was the only real thing. And that single belief left him, and his children, totally defenseless against the one kind of loss money cannot touch. The empire was at its zenith, and the zenith was where the dying began. Look past the yacht's glittering deck at the two children growing up on it, and the crack is already there. Alexander and Christina were raised inside almost unimaginable wealth and profound emotional cold. Their parents' marriage curdled into a famously bitter affair and divorce. The children were shuttled between homes, staff, and boarding schools, raised more by nannies than parents. Their father, for all his charm, measured the world in deals and dollars, and was often absent. And Christina absorbed the family's deepest wound earliest. Dark-haired and dark-eyed in a world that worshipped a certain kind of blonde, glittering beauty, she grew up feeling she was a disappointment. Not pretty enough, not her father's favorite, never quite enough. In a family that valued what could be measured and sold, a sensitive girl learned the most damaging lesson of all, that she herself was not the prize. The fortune attached to her was. She would spend her entire life trying to disprove it. And every person who came close would have to answer the question burning underneath. Is it me, or is it the money? Aristotle Onassis had armored his fortune against every disaster he could imagine. War, revolution, bankruptcy, fire. He had built a wealth that could survive the end of the world. But on a January morning in 1973, a small seaplane lifted off the runway at Athens airport, and within seconds, the one catastrophe the great Onassis had never armored against came screaming down out of the sky. It would shatter him. It would begin the destruction of his entire family, and it would leave the whole empire, in the end, on the shoulders of the one child he had never thought was enough. By the early 1970s, the Onassis dynasty looked, from the outside, utterly invincible. The fortune was at its height. The fleet ruled the seas. And in 1968, Aristotle had pulled off the most sensational social coup imaginable. He married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated American president, the most famous woman in the world. The refugee from Smyrna now had, quite literally, an American first lady as his wife, and here is where the story lulls you. The yacht, the island, the president's widow. You look at this and you think, this is a family that has won, that has escaped permanently the ordinary human fates of loss and grief. Surely money on this scale buys a kind of immunity. It buys nothing of the sort, and behind the glittering facade, the cracks were already spreading. The Jackie marriage, dazzling to the world, was a wound to the children. Alexander and Christina, by every account, resented it deeply. They were loyal to their mother, Tina, and saw the famous American widow as an intruder and her marriage to their father as a cold transaction. The family was already fracturing along its emotional fault lines, even as the cameras flashed. And Aristotle's true heir, the one he was grooming to inherit the empire, was not Christina. It was her older brother, Alexander. Handsome, headstrong, the chosen son, being shaped to one day command the entire Onassis world. The dynasty had a future, a plan, a crown prince. It had everything. It had, in fact, about 2 years left before the calm shattered completely. It was January 22nd, 1973. Athens Airport. Alexander Onassis, 24 years old, the heir to the entire Onassis empire, boarded a small Piaggio seaplane to oversee a test flight with a new pilot. Seconds after takeoff, the aircraft banked wrongly, lost control, and crashed. Alexander suffered catastrophic head injuries. He died the next day. He was 24 years old. The man who had armored himself against every conceivable loss now sat in a hospital corridor, helpless, as the one thing money could not save, his son, slipped away. All the supertankers, all the islands, all the fortune built to be untouchable. None of it could buy back 20 seconds of a January morning. Aristotle Onassis was never the same man again. Watch the founder's doctrine collapse in real time. He had spent 50 years proving that enough money makes you invulnerable. His son's death proved in an instant that the entire philosophy was a lie. That the things which actually matter were precisely the things his fortune could never reach. He could not absorb it. He became consumed by grief and by paranoia, convinced the crash had been sabotage, an assassination, pouring money into investigations, offering vast rewards, chasing conspiracies. He could not accept that the universe had simply taken his son, the way it had once taken his city. That randomness was the one enemy his wealth could not fight. His health, already declining, began to fail rapidly. The grief was, by many accounts, killing him. And it was not finished with the family. In 1974, barely a year after Alexander's death, Christina's mother, Tina, died. Suddenly in Paris. She was 45. The cause was officially reported as a lung edema, but it was widely believed to have been an overdose. The woman at the center of the family's bitter marriages and rivalries was gone, too. And then in March 1975, Aristotle Onassis himself died, his body broken by illness and grief, less than 2 years after the son whose death he never recovered from. Count the losses and count the time. In roughly 26 months, Christina Onassis lost her brother, her mother, and her father. By the spring of 1975, she was 24 years old, the same age Alexander had been when he died, and almost everyone who had defined her world was dead. She was the last Onassis standing. And onto her shoulders, the entire weight of the empire, and the entire weight of the family's grief, now fell. To understand what those 26 months did to Christina, you have to understand who the first casualty truly was. And it was not only Alexander. Alexander was the chosen heir. The son the founder was grooming, the future of the dynasty. His death in that seaplane was the first catastrophe, the proof that the Onassis fortune, for all its size, was built on the same fragile human beings as any other family. But the deeper casualty, the one who would carry the wound for the rest of her life, was the sister left behind. Christina adored her brother. She had also, by every account, spent her childhood competing for the love of a father who favored his son and found his daughter wanting. And now Alexander was dead. Her mother was dead. Her father was dead, and she was left as the sole heir, having never once, in any of their lifetimes, felt that she had been enough for any of them. She inherited their empire. She did not inherit their love, because they were gone before she could ever win it. This is the true inheritance, not the $500 million, but the wound underneath it. The founder built his life on the belief that money was the only real thing. I passed that belief to a daughter, along with the fortune. And so Christina inherited both halves of his doctrine at once, the money that was supposed to make her invulnerable, and the terrible suspicion, bred into her since childhood, that money was the only thing about her that anyone, even her own family, had ever truly valued. How do you learn to be loved, when everyone who was supposed to teach you died before you could believe you deserved it? The first tragedy. Not Christina's death, not yet. The tragedy that everyone who might have made her feel like enough was gone by the time she was 24, leaving her alone at the top of a fortune that confirmed her deepest fear. that she was valuable, and that her value and the money were the same thing. The grief nearly destroyed her. By many accounts, she struggled profoundly in these years, episodes of deep depression, periods in which those around her feared for her life, a fragility that the world's largest private fortune was utterly powerless to heal. And yet she did something remarkable. She did not collapse. She stepped forward, took the wheel of the empire, and tried, through work and through love, to build a life worth living out of the wreckage. The question was whether a woman taught that money was everything could ever find the one thing it couldn't buy. She would try 4 times. To the world, Christina Onassis rose from the ashes like her father before her. She took control of the family's shipping interests and threw herself into the business with real determination. She was now one of the richest women on earth, the head of a global empire, a fixture in the gossip columns, jetting between Monaco, Paris, New York, and the family island of Scorpios. The press built her into a glamorous figure, the dark-eyed heiress, the jet-set queen, the woman who had everything. But the public glamour was a costume over a private desperation. Behind the headlines, Christina was waging a brutal, lifelong war against her own body, her weight swinging dramatically, by some accounts between extremes, as she cycled through crash diets, amphetamines, and binge eating driven by depression. She developed a notorious dependence on Diet Coke, and a relationship with food that mirrored, exactly, her relationship with love. A frantic, painful hunger that nothing ever satisfied. See the pattern the childhood planted. A woman who never felt she was enough, who could not trust that anyone wanted her for herself, now controlled a fortune that let her fill every void except the real one. With food, with jets, with houses, with husbands. She could buy any comfort on earth. She just couldn't buy the feeling of being loved. So she went looking for it the only way her family had ever taught her. She went shopping for it. Christina Onassis would marry 4 times in 17 years. A California realtor, a Greek shipping scion, a Soviet official from behind the Iron Curtain, a French playboy. And each marriage, in its own way, would be haunted by the same ghost. The question she could never silence and could never answer. Do you love me? Or do you love the $500 million standing behind me? Christina Onassis's search for love began, fittingly, in rebellion against her father. And it set the pattern for everything that followed. In 1971, 2 years before the deaths began, the 20-year-old Christina married an American real estate developer named Joseph Bolker. He was a divorced businessman from Los Angeles, Jewish, 27 years her senior. Almost the exact opposite of the dynastic Greek shipping match her father had in mind. Aristotle Onassis was reportedly enraged. The marriage, by most accounts, was a young woman's desperate grab at affection and escape, and it could not survive the pressure the family brought to bear on it. It lasted barely 9 months. Watch the wound go to work in that very first marriage. Christina did not choose calmly. She chose a man much older, a recurring pattern for her, someone who felt safe, fatherly, who seemed to want her rather than the dynasty. And the moment the full weight of the Onassis fortune and the Onassis will pressed down on it, the marriage shattered. Even her first attempt at love proved her deepest fear, that in her world, the money was always the real story, and she was the footnote. Then came the cascade, Alexander, Tina, Aristotle, and on the far side of that grief, in 1975, the same year she buried her father, Christina married again, almost immediately. Husband number 2 was Alexander Andriadis, the son of a Greek banking and industrial family. On paper, this was the proper dynastic match her father would have wanted. Greek, wealthy, suitable. But a suitable marriage entered into in the depths of fresh grief is not a foundation, it's a life raft. The Andriadis marriage was brief and unhappy, ending within roughly a year. Christina was reaching for stability in the one season of her life when she had the least of it to offer or receive. She was 25, orphaned, alone at the top of an empire, and trying to fill the silence where her entire family used to be. 2 marriages, 2 failures, and the question underneath each one growing louder. Here is what made Christina's search so uniquely impossible, more impossible, even, than the other heiresses whose stories echo hers. She was not merely rich. She controlled one of the largest private fortunes on earth, and she knew, with total clarity, exactly how attractive that fortune was. Every man who approached her, every man who smiled at her across a room, carried the same invisible question mark. She could never switch it off. She could never run the experiment cleanly. because there was no version of Christina Onassis that existed without the $500 million standing behind her. And so there was no way on earth to know if she alone was enough. Her father had built a fortune so large it could survive anything. He never understood that he had also built a prison so complete his daughter could never once be certain she was loved. And so she filled the spaces. She gathered a court around her, friends, companions, an entourage that moved with her between Paris and Monaco and Scorpios. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, genuinely warm, generous to a fault, funny, loyal, desperate to be liked. She showered the people around her with gifts and money, and the more she gave, the harder the question became. Were they here for her, or for the open hand? She had survived the deaths. She had taken command of the empire. She had tried marriage twice and failed twice. And she was about to do the single most baffling thing of her entire life. A choice that stunned the world and revealed, more clearly than anything else, exactly what she was really searching for. She was about to fall in love with a communist. In 1976, at the height of the Cold War, Christina Onassis, daughter of one of the most flamboyant capitalists who ever lived, fell in love with Sergei Kauzov, a mid-level official in the Soviet Union's state shipping bureaucracy. Try to grasp how strange this was. The richest capitalist heiress in the West pursuing a Soviet functionary from a one-room Moscow apartment behind the Iron Curtain in the middle of the Cold War. The press was stunned, her advisors were horrified, and that in a way is exactly the point. Kauzov was not handsome, not rich, not glamorous. He could not possibly be after her in the way the playboys were. And to a woman tormented by the question, do you want me or the money? A man who came from a world with no use for her kind of money must have seemed, briefly, like the one person who might love her for herself. They married in Moscow in 1978. Christina, the $500 million heiress, actually lived for a time in Soviet Moscow, trying to build an ordinary life in a cramped apartment with the man she'd chosen precisely because he seemed immune to her fortune. It is the most poignant experiment of her whole life. She tried to escape the prison of her wealth by marrying a man from outside the system that valued it. But the experiment failed, like the others. The marriage ended within about a year and a half. And there were later suggestions that even Kauzov and the Soviet apparatus around him had their own interests in the connection. The one place she thought she might be wanted for herself turned out to have its own quiet calculations. There was no escaping the question. There was nowhere on earth the money didn't reach. By the end of the 1970s, Christina Onassis had been married 3 times and was alone again, not yet 30. The fortune was intact, the fleet still sailed. But the woman at the center of it was running out of the one thing her father's billions could never replenish. The hope that real love was still possible for her. She had one marriage left in her, and it would give her the only thing she ever truly wanted, and then break her heart more completely than all the others combined. In 1984, Christina Onassis married for the 4th and final time. The groom was Thierry Roussel, a French businessman, blonde, charming, handsome in exactly the glittering way the men of her childhood world had been. And she had loved him, on and off, since she was a teenager. For Christina, this was not a strategic match or a grief-stricken grab. This was the real one of her life. And in 1985, Thierry Roussel gave Christina the single greatest gift of her existence, a daughter. They named her Athena, after Christina's mother. By every account, motherhood transformed Christina. For the first time in her life, here was a person whose love she did not have to question, did not have to buy, could not possibly doubt. A child who was hers. The baby became the absolute center of her world. The one pure, unpurchasable love she had searched for across 4 marriages and a lifetime. She finally had it. The real thing. And it was built on a lie. Because throughout his marriage to Christina, and even before it, Thierry Roussel was maintaining a parallel life with another woman, a Swedish model named Gabi Landhage. He had children with the other woman during his marriage to Christina. The great love of Christina's life, the man she had adored since girlhood, the father of her only child, was leading a double life the entire time. And Christina, who had spent every day of her life unable to trust that she was loved for herself, discovered that her deepest fear had come true in the most intimate way possible. So who betrayed Christina Onassis? Roussel did, plainly and cruelly. But look deeper, the way we always must. Christina was betrayed first by a doctrine, Her father's belief that money is the only real thing, which she absorbed so completely that she could never quite believe in anything else. She chose, again and again, to test love against money, because money was the only language her family had ever taught her. And Roussel was the final devastating answer the world gave her, that even the one love she'd been most certain of had a price tag and a hidden ledger. The marriage was effectively over within a few years, dissolving into a bitter, painful separation, though Christina, by accounts, never stopped loving him and went to extraordinary, heartbreaking lengths to keep him in her orbit, reportedly even continuing to support him financially, paying to keep close to the man who had betrayed her. Think about what that means. She loved him so much and feared abandonment so completely that she was willing to pay to keep him near, to use the very fortune that had poisoned her whole life as the glue to hold together the love it had, just destroyed. What clearer proof could there be of the trap she was born into? She had become her father's daughter completely, using money to try to secure the one thing money cannot secure. This is the betrayal at the heart of Christina's story. Not just a husband's affair, but the final confirmation of the lie she'd been raised on. She had 4 husbands and a fortune beyond counting, and the one love she trusted absolutely turned out to be the deepest deception of all. She had by now only one true love left in the world, her daughter, Athena, and she had only a few years left to give her. By the mid-1980s, Christina Onassis had everything money could buy and almost nothing it could not. Tally the empire. A fortune of well over $500 million, the private island of Scorpios, the legendary yacht, homes in Paris, Monaco, St. Moritz, Buenos Aires, jets at her command, and around her always the entourage, the friends, the companions, the court that moved with her across the world. And here the documented detail arrives that gave this episode its title, and broke the hearts of everyone who later learned it. By her final years, Christina Onassis was reportedly paying people to be her friends, providing apartments, allowances, salaries, and lavish gifts to companions in exchange, essentially, for their presence and loyalty. She could not bear to be alone, and she no longer trusted that anyone would stay without being paid. So she did the only thing her father's doctrine had ever taught her. She bought companionship by the month. The richest heiress in the world had become, by her own arrangement, a woman who literally purchased the people around her, because she had lost all faith that anyone would choose her freely. That is the loneliness the title promises, not the loneliness of being physically alone. She was almost never alone. The far worse loneliness of being surrounded by people and unable to believe that a single one of them was there for her. And her body was waging the same war her heart was. Christina's relationship with food and weight had become a genuine medical danger. Her weight swung violently, gaining 60 or 70 pounds, then crash dieting it off with amphetamines and pills, then gaining it back. She consumed enormous quantities of Diet Coke, by some accounts flown in specially when she couldn't get the brand she wanted. She relied on barbiturates to sleep and stimulants to function. She was, in the most literal sense, consuming herself, a frantic physical hunger that perfectly mirrored the emotional one nothing could fill. Look at the 2 ledgers side by side. On one, an oil tanker empire, an island, the most famous yacht on earth, $500 million. On the other, a woman so starved for genuine affection that she paid for company, and so at war with herself that she was destroying her own body to feel, for a moment, like she might be lovable. The greatest shipping fortune in the world had purchased its heiress a level of loneliness most poor people never know, and understand the engine running underneath all of it, because it is the whole point. Christina never spent money like a person who felt secure, because she never felt secure for one day of her life. She spent it like a wound, frantically, trying to buy the safety, the loyalty, the love that her father's fortune had taught her was the only real currency, and then made impossible for her to ever trust. Every gift was a question. Every paid friend was a confession. Every marriage was an experiment that failed. The fortune wasn't a blessing being enjoyed. It was a wound being endlessly, expensively reopened. By 1988, she was 37 years old, exhausted, heartbroken over Roussel, physically depleted from years of crash dieting and chemical dependence. Her doctors and friends worried for her constantly. She talked of wanting to escape, to start over, to find peace somewhere. In November 1988, she traveled to Argentina, to the country where decades earlier, Her father had arrived as a penniless refugee and begun building the fortune that would define and destroy his daughter. She stayed at a friend's country club villa outside Buenos Aires. On the morning of November 19th, 1988, Christina Onassis was found dead in the bathtub. She was 37. The official cause was acute heart failure. Her heart, weakened by years of abuse from crash dieting, stimulants and pills, had simply given out. The richest woman in the world died in a borrowed bathtub, in the country where her family's fortune began, with her only true love, her 3-year-old daughter, far away, $500 million. And in the end, what did it buy her? A short, frightened, lonely life and a quiet death in someone else's bathroom at 37. That was the inheritance. At the very beginning, I told you Aristotle Onassis drew one conclusion from the burning of Smyrna, a secret belief that became the engine of the entire dynasty. It is time to name it, and to weigh what it cost. He concluded that money is the only thing no one can ever take from you, the only security, the only thing that is truly real. And you can understand exactly why a 16-year-old refugee, watching his city and his family's fortune turn to ash, would believe it. It was the lesson his own life had taught him. Homes burn, countries fall, people die. But a fortune, vast enough, mobile enough, armored enough, can survive anything. So he built that fortune, and he made it the center of his world, the measure of all things, the one true God of the House of Onassis. That was the seed. That was the darkest secret of this dynasty. Not a crime, not a scandal, but a belief. A founder so wounded by loss that he decided money was the only thing worth trusting, and built a family on that foundation. He gave his children everything money could buy, and without ever meaning to, taught them that money was the only thing that mattered, including, in the end, about them. And here is the terrible irony that closes the loop. Aristotle Onassis was right about everything except the thing that mattered most. He was right that money could survive fire and war and revolution. He proved it. But he was catastrophically wrong that money was therefore the only thing that was real. Because the moment his son fell out of the sky, the entire philosophy collapsed. The fortune that survived the burning of Smyrna could not survive a January morning at Athens airport. It could not buy back Alexander. It could not save Christina from herself. It could not purchase, for any of them, the one thing they actually needed: to be loved, simply, for who they were. He built an empire to be invulnerable to loss, and he raised, on that foundation, the loneliest heiress in the world. What is the use of building a fortune that can survive the end of the world, if it cannot give your own daughter a single day of feeling truly loved? Christina was gone at 37. The founder's doctrine had run its full course, from a burning city to a borrowed bathtub. But the story was not quite over. Because Christina had left behind one person, the one love she never had to question. A little girl, 3 years old, who had just become the richest child on the planet. When Christina Onassis died in November 1988, her daughter Athena was 3 years old. And in the space of a single morning, that toddler became one of the most extraordinary children on the planet. Christina had left almost her entire fortune. The shipping empire, the island of Scorpios, the famous yacht, an inheritance worth hundreds of millions of dollars, to her only child. At 3 years old, Athena Roussel was, by the world's reckoning, the richest little girl alive. The press gave her exactly that title. The entire Onassis fortune, built from the ashes of Smyrna and carried through 3 generations of grief, now belonged to a child too young to tie her own shoes. And here the whole dynasty arrives at its final, defining question, the one every story on this channel circles back to. A founder built a fortune to defeat loss, and it produced a lonely son who died young and a daughter who could never feel loved. Now that same fortune, that same beautiful curse, had landed on a 3rd-generation child. Would Athena inherit the wound along with the money, exactly as her mother had? Would the cycle simply repeat? For the first time in the Onassis story, the answer would be different. Because Athena would not be raised by an Onassis. She would not be raised on Scorpios, or aboard the yacht, or inside the empire. She would be raised by the one man who had broken her mother's heart. Her father, Thierry Roussel, far from the Onassis name, in a country that had nothing to do with any of it. After Christina's death, custody of little Athena, and control of the vast fortune, went to her father, Thierry Roussel. And Roussel did something that, whatever you think of the man who betrayed Christina, broke the pattern of 3 generations. He took Athena to Sweden and raised her, alongside his children with Gabi Landhage, the very woman he'd kept hidden during his marriage, in a deliberately ordinary, private family life. Athena grew up not as the Onassis heiress but as a Roussel child in a Swedish household. School, siblings, horses, a normal childhood kept as far as possible from the glare that had consumed her mother and grandfather. Consider the strange mercy buried in this. For 3 generations, the defining tragedy of the Onassis family was that the children were raised inside the fortune, measured by it, isolated by it, taught that money was the only real thing. Athena, almost by accident, was raised outside it, pointedly given an ordinary surname, an ordinary country, an ordinary family. The thing that might finally protect the last Onassis heir was being kept away from the very inheritance that had destroyed the others. It came at a cost and a bitter irony. The fortune itself became a battleground. There were long, painful disputes over the management of Christina's estate and the Onassis Foundation, and over Roussel's control of his daughter's money. The $500 million inheritance, generating exactly the kind of conflict and suspicion that had poisoned every Onassis relationship before it. Even in absence, the money did what it always did. It turned the people around it into adversaries, and the deepest wound was quiet and human. Athena grew up estranged, in significant ways, from the Greek side of her heritage. From the Onassis world, the foundation, the legacy itself. As an adult, she reportedly distanced herself from the Onassis name and even, at points, from Scorpios and the Empire's relics. She had been spared the curse of being raised inside the fortune. But the price was a kind of separation from her own mother's family and history. She had escaped the gilded cage. To do it, she had to walk away from almost everything Christina was. As an adult, Athena Roussel did the most quietly radical thing anyone in this dynasty had ever done. She chose an ordinary life. She did not become a jet-set heiress or a shipping magnate. She became a professional equestrian, a serious competitive show-jumping rider, pursuing a discipline that demanded her own skill, her own nerve, her own daily work. She married within that world. She stepped back from the Onassis empire, reportedly selling or distancing herself from pieces of the legacy, including her connection to Scorpios. She made herself, as far as a person with that inheritance possibly can, private. And in that choice, look at what finally happened to the Onassis doctrine. Aristotle built his life on the belief that money was the only thing that was real and the only thing worth protecting. His granddaughter, handed the largest inheritance of all of them, decided the opposite, that a life of her own, earned in a saddle, far from the cameras and the fortune's gravity, was worth more than being the richest woman in any room. She did the one thing neither her grandfather, nor her mother, nor her uncle ever managed. She refused to let the fortune define her. It is not a fairy tale ending. The estrangements were real, the legal battles ugly, the lost connection to her mother's world a genuine grief. But for the first time in the Onassis story, an heir reached adulthood without being destroyed by the inheritance. The cycle that killed Alexander Young, hollowed out Christina, and broke Aristotle's heart. That cycle, in the 3rd generation, was finally interrupted. Christina Onassis never got to see it. She died believing, as she had her whole life, that she was loved for her money. But she left behind the one love she never doubted. And that child, alone among the Onassis heirs, got out. Lay the whole dynasty out, end to end, and look at what one boy's conclusion on a burning ship finally produced. Aristotle Onassis, the founder, watched Smyrna burn at 16, and decided money was the only thing that could never be taken from him. He spent 50 years proving it. Building one of the great fortunes of the century, an empire of supertankers and islands and the most famous yacht on earth. Alexander, the chosen heir, the son he was grooming to inherit it all, died in a seaplane at 24. And the fortune that could survive war and revolution could not buy back 20 seconds of a January morning. Tina, the mother, dead at 45, alone in Paris, amid the wreckage of the family's bitter marriages. Aristotle himself, dead within 2 years of his son, his great philosophy shattered by the one loss money could not touch, chasing conspiracies because he could not accept that the universe takes what it takes. And Christina, who inherited the whole empire and the whole wound at 24, spent 17 years and 4 marriages searching for the one thing the fortune had taught her to distrust, to keep her company, waged war on her own body, and died in a borrowed bathtub at 37, the richest and loneliest woman in the world. One cause sits beneath all of it, not bad luck, not the plane crash alone, The deepest cause was a doctrine, a wounded boy's conviction that money is the only thing that's real, the only security, the only thing worth trusting. That single belief, passed down with a fortune, meant that an entire family learned to measure everything in money, including love, including each other. And a family that measures love in money can never, ever be sure it is loved at all. How does $500 million produce the loneliest woman on earth? The same way it always does in these stories. When the people at the top come to believe that the fortune is the realest thing about them, and then spend their lives unable to find anyone who disagrees. The Onassis empire could survive the end of the world. It could not give a single one of them an ordinary, certain, unpurchased love. And that, not the plane, not the bathtub, is what actually killed this family. Be careful with the lesson, because it would be easy to take the wrong one. The lesson is not that money is evil, or that the Onassis fortune was a curse cast by fate. Aristotle's genius was real. His rise from refugee to titan is one of the great stories of the century. Money, used well, builds and protects and frees. The villain was never the fortune. The villain was the belief. The boy on the burning ship deciding that because money is the only thing that can't be taken, it must be the only thing that's real. That single substitution, money standing in for everything that actually matters, is what he passed down with the inheritance. And it turned a family, with every advantage on earth, into people who could not trust the one thing they most needed. Now, think about that glass of Diet Coke from the very beginning. Flown across continents by private jet, a small absurd luxury, the loneliest woman in the world reached for again and again. That is the whole story in a single object. It was never really about the Diet Coke. It was a woman with infinite money using it on tiny comfort. Yes, because the enormous comfort, being loved, being safe, being enough, was the one thing all her millions could never deliver. A frantic, endless, expensive reaching for something that money was never going to bring. The fortune could fly a soda across an ocean. It could not make Christina Onassis feel, for one certain day, that she was wanted for herself. And this is where the Onassis family stops being a story and becomes a mirror. Because the substitution Aristotle made, money for the real thing, is one almost every one of us is tempted, in some smaller way, to make too. The Onassis dynasty is the proof of where it ends. There is a boy, somewhere at the start of this story, standing on a ship's deck watching his entire world turn to ash, and deciding, in that fire, that money was the only thing no one could ever take from him again. He was right. He built a fortune that survived everything: war, revolution, bankruptcy, the end of his old world, and he handed it down to a daughter who used it to fly Diet Coke across oceans and to pay people to sit beside her, because the one thing the unburnable fortune could never buy was the certainty that she was loved. Christina Onassis was the loneliest heiress in the world, not despite the $500 million, but because of them. She could buy anything, so she could never trust anything. And she died at 37, in a borrowed bathroom, in the country where the fortune was born. But she left one love she never had to question. And that child did the bravest thing this dynasty ever managed. She rode away from the money and lived.